Okay.
Okay, so just by way of a quick review, since yesterday was the Torah portion, the parsha that we are actually looking at today. So we are in
Really?
sync this for this day this year and won't be in sync again until next year.
Will we be in sync next year?
And we're always in sync once during the year because
Yes.
over the course of the year it covers every parsha and we will always be in
Oh,
some parsha.
Yeah.
It's just the year races ahead of us at quite a rapid pace.
yeah.
Yeah.
Too bad, but yeah.
All right.
I know when I read, I want to do the trope now, but I didn't.
So this will be posted on the website as soon as Rav Tiferet is able to, and that is a full color-coded Hebrew chapters 1 through 3,
Oh, cool.
Wow.
and a full color-coded English chapters 1 through 3. So you can line them up side by side and see how much is in and how much is not in each of the two
Yeah.
different stories. So just by
Mm.
quick review, the opening of Exodus is actually most likely the editor redactor as a bridge from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus. As you'll recall, Genesis ended with Jacob blessing all of his sons and all of them settling in, and they're settled into Goshen. And we are reminded that they were settled in Goshen, and these are the family names, the tribal names that will eventually be the family names that will eventually become the tribal names
Wait,
that are settled there.
should this be red instead of black? Is that
No,
how
it's
we
black
understand?
because that's the editor redactor.
I don't understand why it's not
That
red.
is when whoever it was put the two side by side stories together into one continuous flow, he or they added little bridge material or something to better connect the passages.
Wait, so, but haven't we read everything as red or black or blue?
For the most part, because the redactor in all of the book of Genesis, the redactor is about 20, 25 lines.
Really? So we've had this then
Yes.
in black. So
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you remember way, 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 way back at the beginning of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1 was the blue story of the coastal people.
yeah.
And Genesis chapter 2, beginning with verse 4, was the inland people,
Mm-hmm.
red story. And Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 about Shabbat was the editor redactor.
Oh. So so why do you use the word, what is the difference between redacting and editing?
Just they're technical terms as far as whether you're simply editing the material or adding to it.
Oh,
Okay.
You're actually redacting the material. I mean,
Hmm.
we
yeah.
think of redacting as taking things out,
Yeah.
like anybody's name that we don't want to appear in a
Hmm.
document.
Mm.
Can you remind us like what years these different versions and the redacting happened?
So we have no idea the
Yeah.
the years for the original oral material,
Hmm.
but they are certainly pre uh, Joshua Judges, they're pre the unification of the tribes into a kingdom, but they go back probably hundreds of years. So the best guess is some of these mythologies, which is Genesis, may go back into the second century, the second millennium before the Common Era.
Mm. Wow.
The writing down of the materials as separate materials may have been in the early stage of the first millennium before the Common Era, and the editing, redacting of the materials into one unified document is in the probably middle first millennium, fourth century before the Common Era. And that's the time of the editor redactor and the Deuteronomic author. And we know that the Deuteronomic author is the time of the Second Temple because the Deuteronomic author reports things about what went on in the kingdoms of the Second Temple.
And that was about the fourth BC, fourth century BC,
Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Or BE.
Mm.
So, yeah, so redactor adds material that was not in either text. Editors simply edit the material that was
Yeah.
in the original text. And so it seems clear that but the question is, were the editor and the redactor the same person?
Mm.
And so we don't really know because they did not leave their original documents lying around in form that would survive, and they didn't leave us any footnotes from the committee meetings.
So we think they were written down in the first millennium,
Correct. Yeah, they were clearly written down somewhere,
BC. B.
somewhere in the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, BCE.
And we know that from scrolls that are found.
Right. Well, we know certainly that even prophetic texts are in the Dead Sea material, and the prophets are written down much later than the Torah because the prophets refer back to a Torah. And the stories of Ezra tell us that they're finding documents in the temple.
Does there exist a timeline on this all that has been written down?
There are timelines, yes. There are timelines that are modern critical guesses. There are
Uh,
also, if you go to Chabad and other places, you can find timelines of the claim from the internal text. So it will tell you what happened 5,786 years ago when God said, "Let there be light,"
Yeah.
and then tell you that about 1,300 years after that was Moses and the Exodus,
hmm
and we'll give you a timeline for all of that. Relating that to an historical timeline or a modern critical timeline is not always easy.
hmm
Mm.
Some of the evidence is also the blue text, when it talks about Egypt, actually is less detailed about Egyptian society and more focused on the Hebrew or the children of Israel society, whereas the red text gives us much more of the Egyptian society. But in any case, the actual story of Moses and now the pre Moses in the blue story begins with verse 6 of chapter 1. And all of the stuff about a new king arising and how much the the Hebrew peoples had multiplied during that time. All of that is in chapter 1, and all the story of the midwives, which we looked at, is in chapter 1,
Mm-hmm.
and telling the midwives to provide live birth to girls and stillbirth to boys. And the midwives who didn't do it are all chapter 1. We think of these two stories, chapter 1 and chapter 2, as being one continuous story. But again, in the red story, the Pharaoh, in some time period unstated, for some reason, unstated, says all of the boys have to be thrown into the river. And that's all this Pharaoh says. Because the red story is much more concerned about Moses getting to the palace. So you'll notice chapter 2 is almost all red story.
Yeah.
And it continues down. Notice on this whole rest of chapter 2, there's no blue. The
Yeah.
only blue is those three verses at the end of chapter two,
Mm,
as opposed to chapter one, which was all blue except for one red verse.
mm.
So this is being put together by Dr.
Some editor redactor in the Second Temple period with the who is most likely the Deuteronomic author as well.
No, I actually meant something more recent. The putting these side by side like this,
Oh, that's me.
that's amazing. And have you done that
It
for
is
all of
amazing.
Genesis?
I have not done it for all of Genesis yet.
Are you going to publish this?
It could be. It took Alter, I think, 20 years to publish his. So
Who's that?
Robert Alter
Ah,
published a modern translation of the Torah, actually of the Tanakh,
hmm.
which he had been working on, I guess, along these kinds of lines for most of his career, and then ultimately published them.
So is a lot of this informed by his work?
No, no, I some of his translation I like. No, this is mostly informed by modern criticism. The basic text that I find the easiest to work from is Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible,
Hmm.
Mm,
Interesting.
which I've referred to before. In any case, the whole midwifing thing also doesn't give us a timeline. Joseph died and all his brothers, and then they were fruitful and multiplied, verse 7, and verse 8, a new king arose. How long did it take from verse 6 to verse 8? In other words, how long is verse 7? We don't know. In later genealogies that Exodus gives us and other sections of the Torah give us, it was about 3 generations. However, according to other passages in the Torah and according to the rabbinic understanding of it, this was 400 years. Joseph and all of his generations die, and 10 years later, or 390 years later, a new king arises. And that king doesn't like all these swarming people on his east coast. And so he says to the midwives, get rid of the boys, let's stop all this multiplying of them.
mm.
And the midwives don't. And he calls the midwives in, and they give an excuse. And it seems that he's satisfied with their excuse. And the next thing we know, they're being enslaved, persecuted, burdened with service. In this story, it would seem that when he couldn't get rid of them, Pharaoh decided to burden them and set taskmasters over them. And the next thing in the blue story is a guy by the name of Moses who's out in Midian with Yitro, his father in law, gets a call from a burning bush to go and save the Hebrews in Egypt. And that seems to be a very short time span. So much unlike the traditional understanding, they were slaves for 400 years. In the blue story, they were burdened for a few weeks. So we have no idea what our time frame is on that. Meanwhile, in the red story, the Pharaoh is not interested in stillbirthing the boys. The Pharaoh is actually interested in killing the boys. And Pharaoh says to all of his people, every son birthed toward the river you will send them, and every daughter you will let live. So is Pharaoh here creating an Egyptian ice to go raid the Hebrew settlements, grab all the boys, and throw them in the river?
Wow.
Did the same Pharaoh who wanted the birth boys killed?
Well,
Or,
no, because it's a different story. It's a red story, not a blue story.
But it
yeah.
doesn't make sense, just like now it doesn't, because supposedly the Israelites were slaves building the great monuments, building, right?
Yes, which we're going to find out that they built Pitom and Ramses
But
in one of the stories, but not in the other story.
so if a son birthed, does that include men? Is that the next generation of builders? Is that all men?
Exactly. Is it the son when he's birthed
Hmm.
or every male?
Hmm.
It has to be the son when he's birthed, because they wouldn't get rid of all their slaves
Right. Which would mean that
unless they were stupid like Trump, right?
exactly. And so in that story, a woman becomes pregnant from the tribe of Levi
Hmm.
and has a son after that command,
Hmm.
which means that she could have had children before the command who are alive,
Hmm.
which then explains how Aaron, the older brother of Moses, is able to be around and didn't need to be saved.
Hmm. Aaron is older,
Aaron is
He's
older.
older. Yeah.
and Miriam is
And
older.
so the whole getting Pharaoh into the palace
Hmm.
is the red story only.
I mean, getting Moses into the palace?
Getting Moses, rather,
Mhm.
into the palace.
Hmm.
And the entire childhood of Moses is over here beginning in verse 7, when Moses's older sister, Miriam, goes and watches over the boy and watches Pharaoh's daughter take her, who knows that it's a Hebrew boy, and says, "Let me find you a nursemaid for the boy." And she nurses him. And by verse 10, he grows up. And that's all we know is he got bigger. He got dull. He grew up. And then the nursemaid or the nanny or whatever she is brings the boy to Pharaoh's daughter, and now she raises him, and she names him Moshe, an Egyptian name given a Hebrew etymology.
That's really interesting. The first time I realized that it was an Egyptian name, because I had no connection. I always thought it was a Hebrew name.
Yes, and if you look at the Egyptian names that we have, Tutmosis, Ramses, Ramses is Ra Moses,
Hmm.
Ra Moses, Moses of the god Ra.
Huh.
So here he is, Moses, without a god,
So Moses doesn't mean drawn from the water?
only in the Hebrew false etymology to make it a Hebrew word. Here
Ah,
in verse 10, and it would be strange that Pharaoh's daughter, speaking Egyptian, would use a Hebrew etymology to name her child.
Yeah.
true, true.
And the next thing we know, Moses is old enough to go wandering out and kill an Egyptian.
Yeah.
Therefore, the whole thing about Moses and the little burning ember is inserted by the rabbis in between verse 10 and verse 11.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
There's nothing about him growing up in the palace except a bridge or a break in the line from verse 10 to verse 11.
Hmm.
In this week's Torah portion, yesterday, Moses goes out and in verse 12 looks around and does not see anyone else and strikes the Egyptian and then hides him in the sand. A question there that we raised in our Torah study at TBZ was he looking around for help, or was he looking around to make sure nobody saw what he was going to do? And the answer to that question then helps you create a midrash on the personality of Moses. But meanwhile, he flees and he ends chapter 2 working for his father-in-law, working for his father-in-law and giving birth to a boy named Gershom. Chapter 3 now is the call, and that's where we are today. Chapter 3, he's out tending the flock, and a bush is burning, and it isn't consumed, and God calls to him from the burning bush, and God says all these things to him. And meanwhile, in the blue story,
What was that?
Moses was shepherding the flock. Moses, who was not in the story until suddenly appears like magic in the blue story, because this is the northern kingdom who aren't really concerned with Egypt and the whole Pharaoh system,
Mm.
and just has to get Moses to save us.
I mean, last night I was reading in my daily, Hebrew devotion, and it was talking about how Gabriel smote the nurse or the nursemaids from the Pharaoh's daughter because Pharaoh's daughter wasn't going to kill Moses. And they said, "You're going to disobey your father?" And then Gabriel came and smote them. And that's
Yep,
all it
all
said.
midrash,
Yeah, it was a midrash. Yeah.
all
Where
midrash.
did you read that, Karen?
I have a daily devotion. I've had it for like 6 years. I bought it in Brookline, at the bookstore, and I've read it every night,
Hmm.
and every year when I read it, it's just like when you read the Torah, it just sounds like brand new. And it
Yeah,
was a midrash from last night's
Hmm.
daily devotion, and it was talking about, that the Pharaoh's daughter wanted to keep the baby, and her nursemaids, or not nursemaids, but her entourage,
her
whatever, her
maidservants.
maidservants were afraid, and they said, "Aren't you gonna throw the baby back in the water?" And because your father commanded it, and so then Gabriel, the angel of anger, came and smote them because they were against, the daughter taking the baby.
Yeah. All right. So meanwhile,
I know. Meanwhile,
here we are. And this week, the bulk of chapter 3 that we're reading is Moses' encounter with God. And now we'll be able to take a look and see this. So, Vayomer Moshe El HaElohim. So, Moses now is at a bush that in the blue story is not burning, it's simply a bush. That he hears a voice coming from the bush, and the voice is calling him, and the voice uh, says to Moses, I got a job for you, and I want you to go and I want to save all of those people there in Goshen from the Egyptian burdens. And Moses says, Vayomer Moshe El HaElohim, Hine anochi va el bnei Yisrael va'amarti lahem Elohei avotechem shalachani alechem va'amru li ma shemo ma omar alehem. So Vayomer Moshe El HaElohim, Moses says to, and here we have the perennial question we always must ask, I believe, when we're reading this in this kind of form, is HaElohim the gods, or the God that is appearing in the bush from the gods, or God, the Hebrew God? And there's not an answer to that unless, except for the one you decide to take, or you decide to read from the tradition. So Moses says, Hine anochi va el bnei Yisrael. Behold, I am coming, literally, I am coming to the children of Israel, or I are usually translated as I will come, but I come. I'm coming. So here I am. I'm drawing out the scenario for you. I'm coming to the children of Israel, to all of this group, and I will say to them, Elohei avotechem shalachani aleichem. The God or gods of your fathers sent me to you. And here in the scenario that I'm painting out, that I'm pre-planning, va'amru li, and they will say to me, Ma shemo, what is that God's name? And I will have to then answer them. So ma omar alehem, what will I say to them? Vayomer Elohim el Moshe, Ehyeh asher Ehyeh, Vayomer ko tomar livnei Yisrael, Ehyeh shalachani aleichem. And Vayomer ale Elohim, and so again, God representative, whatever, says to Moshe, Ehyeh asher Ehyeh. Literally, I will be that I will be. Vayomer ko tomar, and so that God said, Elohim said, thus tomar, you will say, Yisrael, to the children of Israel, Ehyeh shalachani aleichem, I will be, sent me to you. A problem with this, of course, is that nowhere in the book of Genesis is God ever referred to in relationship to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, or Yosef as Ehyeh.
Mhm.
Mm.
So what this story is saying is when I say to them, what's the name of your God? I have to say to them, God told me you can't know my name. I would cast Jack Nicholson in the role of God in this particular scene. You can't know my name. You can't handle my name. Vayomer Elohim El Moshe Ehyeh
Where
Asher
are you?
Ehyeh was
Where are
verse
you?
14. Now we're verse 15.
Oh.
Vayomer Od Elohim El Moshe Ko Tomar El Bnei Yisrael Adonai Elohei Avotechem Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Ve'Elohei Yaakov Shalachani Ela Aleichem Zeh Shemi Le'olam V'Zeh Zichri L'Dor Dor. This particular verse, verse 15, is in deep argument among modern scholars as to whether it should be in blue or red or black,
Mm.
because it's a blending of the two names Adonai Elohim.
Yes. Mm.
So there is debate as to where verse 15 stands. But after saying, and one of the evidences for the debate of not being in the blue is that after saying, say Ehyeh sent you, then this God says further, however, now you can say Yud He Vav He sent you.
Mhm.
Mm.
And that's one of the editor redactor passages that's often used to say that it went from Ehyeh sent you in the blue story, and now back to the red story, verse 16, Lech v'asafta et zignei Yisrael v'amarta aleihem Adonai Elohei avotechem nir'ah Elai Elohei Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov lemor pakod pakadati etchem ve'et ha'asui lachem b'Mitzrayim. And that's the only red here in verse 3.
When the word Elohe, that's been used with Adonai before, right? Your God, or
Yes,
not?
Elohei is gods of, Elohim of.
But Elohe is
So Elohim is
God's, is it
it's a
God's
generic
of or
term.
God of?
Well,
Elohe.
Elohei is God of or gods of. It's
Okay.
Elohim. It's again,
Okay.
how do you want to translate Elohim?
So my
as the
question, I
plural.
guess, you said it's the first time you see Elohim and Adonai in the same, but
No,
have
I
we
said
seen but have we seen before Adonai Elohe?
no, we've seen Adonai Elohim. I didn't say it's the first time. I
Oh,
said it's the first time here in this passage.
okay. But even so, the two different names of God are here. But in the past, when we saw Adonai, your God, did they use the word Elohe?
Yes, yes. In the Yud He Vav He stories, Elohim is a generic God's term.
Right.
In the Blue story, it seems to be more a specific formal name of the God.
And yeah.
It's
But
confusing because
but did we see Elohe, your God, using Adonai? In other words, that word not implying gods, but your God.
again, your God with a small g.
Yes. No.
Yes, in the Yud
Okay.
He Vav
Then
He, we've seen
I'm
it.
confused.
Well, the Hebrew doesn't give us capital and lowercase.
Yeah. But we've seen Adonai a lot, right?
We see Adonai
Uh,
a lot because there's a lot of red
okay.
story.
Right. Have we seen Adonai saying Adonai and then followed by your God a lot? Has that been part of the red story?
Yes, Elohe, but in the red story, the modern critical says that that should be small g when it's in the Adonai story.
Okay. And oh, I see. And it's a big G when it's in the blue story.
Correct.
So it's just used as an adjective. That's what I guess I'm trying to find out. We've seen it as an adjective before.
Yeah, in that sense,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So therefore, the blue story ends quite nicely in verse 14. The red story picks up quite nicely in verse 16. And so that's some of the evidence that used to say that verse 15 was created as a bridge when the two passages were put together to
Yeah.
pretend that they were one passage.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
What
So, because in verse 16, the God from the bush
Mhm.
says, Lech ve'asafta et ziknei Yisrael, go and gather together the elders of Israel. Va'amarta alehem, and you will say to them, Adonai Elohei avotechem, Yud He Vav He, the God of your fathers, Nirah Eli, appeared to me, Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Lamor, saying to me, or saying, Pakod Pakadati, I have visited, I have encountered, I have become connected to, Etchem you, Vet ha'asui lachem b'Mitzrayim, and all that is being done to you in Egypt. So these are two different things that Moses is being told at this bush from the blue vantage point and the red vantage point. And as we continue it next week, you will find the rest of 3 is all red.
Hmm.
And this is what you'll be reading, practicing for next week. Va'omar ale etchem me'oni Mitzrayim el eretz hakanaani hachiti v'ha'emori v'haprizi v'hachivi v'hayevusi el eretz savat chalav udavash. And Canaan, as being this conglomerate nation of all these different peoples, is much more a southern kingdom recognition than a northern kingdom recognition. Okay, continuing 18. V'shama'u lekolecha uvata ata v'ziknei Yisrael el melech Mitzrayim va'amartem elav Adonai Elohei ha'Ivriyim Nikra Aleinu Ata Nilchana Derech Shloshet Yamim Bamidbar V'nizbecha Ladonai Eloheinu. 19. Va'ani yadati ki lo yiten etchem melech Mitzrayim lahaloch velo biyad chazaka. 20. V'shalachti et yadi v'hiketi et Mitzrayim bechol niflotai asher e'eseh b'kirbo v'achareichen yishalach etchem. Verse 21, V'natati et chen ha'am hazeh ve'enei Mitzrayim v'haya ki tilechun lo telchu rekam. 22, V'sha'ala isha mishkenta umigarat beita kol chesef uchlei zahav usmalot v'samtem al b'neichem v'al b'notechem v'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim.
This is troubling. We never read, we never talked about this at Passover, that they were supposed to plunder their neighbors,
Oh,
take
actually,
all their gold
sometimes,
and silver.
yeah. Well, that's sometimes that's not necessarily discussed at Passover, but that's discussed in reading these Torah portions as to, and the later ones, where did they get all the stuff to build the tabernacle?
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, no, I wondered that, but I always assumed that, like how it seems like a lot of Indian families put their money into jewelry. I don't know if it's true, but you see in movies people who are not high status who seem to have nice jewelry that's their wealth.
Yes,
Right? And so I just assumed that that was the same of the Israelites. They were poor, maybe, because they were slaves. We don't really know what slaves are, but they made jewelry and they had jewelry and they had, they saved in gold or whatever.
you mean in their free time when they weren't making bricks and gathering the straw and building
Yeah, yeah,
cities?
there were some jewelry makers among them, hidden in the bushes, but I didn't really think of them plundering
Yep.
Yeah.
Egypt. That's
Well, and this whole thing about God says, they're not going to let you go. I know they're not going to let you go. That's why I'm sending you so I can really inflict a lot of stuff on them.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not one of the more favorable views of God if you want to read it that way.
or the Jews following his directions,
Right.
or the directions of their imagined God who's telling them to do this. Oh, the the powers that be told
Right. And
us.
so you'll notice again as you're reading next week's portion that we're studying, there's a lot of Adonai Elohei, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Elohecha. One of the challenges to translating that is Moses and the elders are going to Pharaoh, who considers himself a god and who follows gods. So again, is it small g, Yud He Vav He, our God, not your God,
Mm.
or Adonai Elohim, Lord God, with capital letters, as it's often translated because of later commentaries of a combined text. But when we pull it apart into the two separate texts, did the original, and in Exodus, we've moved through, in Genesis, we've moved from mythology to legend. And now in Exodus, we're dealing with northern or blue or coastal legendary material, not mythologic material, and southern kingdom or inland legendary, not mythologic. So is Moses real? Is Moses, as we asked about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all the brothers, were they real or were they legend, which means they were real, but not in the way of the legend?
Mhm.
But it's not mythology in the sense of the early stories of Genesis when we deal with creation and flood stories that have no global uh, root.
Wait, what is the global root? What do we
That
need to
is,
see? see
There's
here that makes this not
there was no
mythology?
actual witness to the creation of the earth and the
Right,
heavens.
right. But what makes this, what do we know from this time to be true that makes
That
this,
there were ancestors to a group of people who came to be called the Hebrews that were perhaps varyingly Abraham or Isaac, Jacob or Joseph, or Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. There are a bunch of names that they received, but the stories are lost in the mists of oral history.
but Noah is a name.
But Noah is a name that actually is a name that means the one who gives us surcease. That is the one who saves us from the flood.
Oh,
So what,
And
but
Noah's
what,
wife is not named. You'll notice everybody, starting with Abraham, we get the names of the wives,
Mhm.
except for Lot.
But is there anything to tell us that the Jews lived in Egypt and the Jews left Egypt?
Very little.
Anything?
There is some Egyptian steles that recognize that the Egyptians knew of a people who were called Israel.
wow.
So
There's no
just,
evidence they enslaved them.
well, we know that everyone has ancestors, but couldn't these still be mythology?
Yes, that's why I'm saying it. We're moving from mythology into legend.
Hmm.
So there was a Midianite Egyptian Moses character.
Hmm.
The Blue Story knew of him as a Midianite, and the Red Story knew of him as an Egyptian.
Hmm.
Mm.
And the Torah will know him as a Levite. So
Interesting.
there's some biblical critics, historians, who say, and I am persuaded by their argument, that in fact the only group that was actually in Egypt was the group that became the Levites,
Mm.
who then moved into Canaan and took these Semitic Hebrew type, these tribes who had ancestral names of Reuben, Simeon, etc., Yehuda, Ephraim, etc., and forcibly combined them into a unified tribe in the same way that Muhammad would later do with the Arabian tribes and give them a story of common ancestry.
But those of us who are fair-skinned and blue-eyed, talking about them as our ancestors, I've been convinced I'm a Khazar since the 70s when I read a book by Arthur Kessler called The 13th
Yeah,
Tribe,
yeah,
and
and based on the older story of the Khazari.
which, of course, anyone who's Zionistic has to be against, right? Has to say is impossible. But I found it so interesting.
So we are either ultimately children of converts to
Mhm.
this Middle Eastern tribal view,
Mm.
or we are mixed breeds interbred with this this ancient tribe. One way
Can
or
I,
another, they are our ancestors, whether they're
Yeah.
our spiritual ancestors, as converts will
yeah,
claim,
can
or
I tell?
our genealogical genetic ancestors as those who have DNA done and show Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi then were either mixed breed or converts,
Mhm.
and those who show the earlier Middle Eastern genetic markers are probably actually really descendants.
So can I tell a story about this?
Absolutely.
So Kessler writes this book, The 13th Tribe, and basically his premise is that when Jews were counted before they were thrown out of countries in the Middle Ages, like out of Germany or England or whatever, there were maybe 10,000. There were very few. And then before World War II, there were millions. And there was no way that these small numbers could become such big numbers if there wasn't conversion. So looks at all these old texts and theories, and apparently there's this diary by this merchant um, who around 900 maybe writes that the Khazar king, the Khazars came from the Caucasus, um, was looking at the division of the world, and he decides the world is divided between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and he needed to align himself with one of these groups. So he has a wise men from each group come in. I read this in the 70s, but I remember it so clearly. He has a wise man from each group come in and tell him what he should be, make the case. So the Christian comes and says, be anything but a Muslim. The Muslim comes in and says, be anything but a Christian. So he goes with a Jew. And so they go up, they're conquering Eastern Europe, going north, and he calls himself a Jew, and maybe some people convert to be the same religion as the princely class, but doesn't really know what this means. And then at some point, maybe 1200, 1300, 1400, they get the wise men in to teach them what it is to be a Jew. And that's when, and it continues. Okay. And then he shows, he has these drawings of the characteristics, physical characteristics we identify as Jewish, and you see how absolutely different they are from each other. And yet we see them as Jewish. And he says, just like food, stuffed cabbage, this or that, stuffed cabbage we think is Jewish, but it comes from these countries that are stuffed cabbage, etc. But the thing that really got me about this book was that as was reading this book in the 70s, I got a letter from my grandmother. My grandmother was the only grandparent who was born in the US of parents who came from, I think it was the Kiev area. And and um and it was the first, I don't think I went to camp since I was 6 years old, sleepaway camp. I don't think I'd ever gotten a letter from my grandmother, ever. Okay. So maybe I did, but this was so surprising. And it had an article from the New York Times. I thought the New York Times, my grandfather had gotten that at some point, but he was long dead. What was my grandmother was reading the New York Times? And so it was an article about the expansion of the subway in Kiev. And it said the expansion had to stop because they found the archaeological ruins of a Khazar settlement. And my grandmother says, do you remember I told you that we came from, I think this is the town my family's from, right? My grandmother's blonde hair, blue-eyed, and but it's interesting. They called the town in the translation, I guess, into Russian at the time was White Church. But it was a Khazar settlement. And it just hit me, that I'm reading this book. I'm a Khazar, There's no doubt I'm a Khazar. So it had a lot of meaning, and I remembered this book so carefully. And I've since looked up, if you Google Khazars and Jews or whatever, you'll see all the rabbis poo-pooing this theory, because then what is our right of return if we're just converts? So,
So, I mean, that's actually I mean, Kessler's, some of the issues that are taken with Kessler, not so much about whether the Kuzari and the Khazar story was true or fable or whatever, but it was, or whether it was written as an example of what was going on. The issue is taken is the numbers that he uses, because some scholars, conversion by Jews of others, of pagans, to Judaism was a very active and rampant process from the temple period in through the expansion of the Hellenistic world. So after Alexander conquers, Jews spread into Alexandria and all sorts of other places. There are estimates
through conversion.
through conversion. There are
Mhm.
estimates that at the height of the Roman Empire, there were approximately 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish,
Really?
which would make the number of Jews at the time of Jesus 1 million people.
Wow.
And in fact, Christianity and the whole conversion process of the New Testament is Jewish. And
Wait, say that
Judaism
again.
only stops being a conversion seeking community after Constantine, when the Roman Empire makes it a capital crime to convert to Judaism or to cause someone to convert to Judaism. Only then does Judaism stop being a missionary religion.
Hmm.
So the idea of the Khazar conversion certainly would have been symbolic of the stuff that was happening
Hmm.
in an earlier period by so-called Jewish missionaries.
So did that population then continued even though were those Jews, the Hellenistic and Roman Jews, were they converted to Christianity or was
No, no,
Christianity
the Jews
pagans
stayed Jews.
and the pagans converted?
And that's why the New Testament switches from reaching out to Jews to reaching out to Greeks,
Hmm.
Hmm.
reaching out to pagans,
Hmm.
because they tried to reach out to Jews to, in a sense, reform their view of the Messiah, and the Jews didn't buy it.
Interesting. And they stopped, but in their conversions, well, it's interesting because the conversions to Judaism and the conversions to the Christian type of Judaism, right? It was emerging. So the Christians had to stop doing um, uh, doing
Well, they eliminated circumcision,
circumcision
but they
because
also eliminated following the 613 mitzvot.
mm,
In
yeah,
any case,
interesting. So interesting.